Next tonight, crime and punishment in the Soviet Union. A 5-day prison riot ended today in the Ukraine when commandos ousted the convicts who had barricaded themselves inside. At least 5 people were killed since that uprising. A second prison riot on Sunday was put down the next day. In both cases, the prisoners were protesting their living conditions, and an official investigating the Ukrainian riot complained that people who had not been convicted of crimes were being held along with convicted criminals. This is not an unusual occurrence in the Soviet Union. Alan Abel of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's Journal program was given a rare inside look at the Soviet justice system. Here is his report.
In the center of Leningrad, in a red brick dungeon nearly a century old, is the labyrinthine maze of cells and towers known as the Crosses, a famous and infamous landmark never before opened to foreign television cameras. Tsar Nicholas II had the Crosses built as a prison in 1892, but the Soviet Union believes in reform through useful labor, not years of wasting away in a penitentiary cell. So the Crosses is now a detention center where suspects sit and wait while the evidence against them is collected. The waiting can take weeks or months or years. Each day, a new harvest of inmates arrives in the Crosses. They are not convicted criminals, merely suspects sent from precinct police stations. About 60% of those charged with more than a trifling offense serve pretrial detention. With shaven heads, in thick denim suits, they're held here usually for 6 to 9 months without access to legal counsel. They're interrogated and examined, and when the state is ready, they will be brought to trial. For prisoners who misbehave, the cellar of the Crosses holds these stark punishment cells, part of a system of confinement that for more than 70 years has been the first leg on the communist road to justice. Professor Lev Klein, a prominent archaeologist, spent 9 months in the Crosses during the Brezhnev era on a false political charge.
There were 10 people crammed in my cell, a space of 2.5 by 3.5 meters. I did a survey asking how many had been beaten. 8 out of 10 said they had been beaten either by the militia or during their interrogation.
Was there homosexuality practiced among the prisoners?
Of course.
In a brutal way?
Yes.
Each cell has a radio speaker in it, and from time to time they announce that in such a cell, the inmates gang raped so-and-so prisoner. The administration always asked for witnesses, but nobody ever came forward.
Please be seated.
It's a routine criminal case, assault with a weapon. One man with a history of alcoholism and petty crime stabbed a drinking buddy with a kitchen knife.
Will the accused, Sergei Nikolaevich Petrov, please rise?
The defendant, Sergei Petrov, waited 5 months in the Crosses while the state assembled its case. The victim, Alexei Gerasimov, has recovered enough to testify. Prosecutor Viktor Mikhailov is seeking 6 years in a labor camp for Petrov. And lawyer Yuri Levednov has been appointed to the curious and controversial role of counsel for the defense. This is the procuratorial system of justice, similar to the process used in many European countries. But here, one central commandment: the state is never wrong.
Now I'll explain your rights according to Article 46 of the Criminal Code. You have the right to participate in the proceedings. You have the right to ask questions of members of the court. You can petition. You have the right to make correcting statements. You have the right to appeal a verdict and to retain a lawyer. Do you trust your defense to the lawyer Levednov?
I would like to petition the court.
Proceed.
I'm not happy with my lawyer. I want another one.
What is your reason for not wanting to have Levednov as your lawyer?
I haven't had a chance to discuss the case with him.
So, you want another lawyer, right?
Yes.
Right.
It's the first time in 5 months Petrov has had a chance to speak up, and he's done it. He's decided that he doesn't like his lawyer. And during this hasty recess, it's clear that his lawyer doesn't like him either.
Unfortunately, I cannot say anything flattering about my client. He has a record of violating the law, and in the past, he has been found guilty on 3 different occasions. My deeply held personal opinion is that it would be immoral to defend this man. Fighting for his innocence would not reflect the morality of our society.
In a few minutes, they're back in court, and the defendant has been convinced to let Levednov plead his case. So on with the trial, a process that begins with a recitation of Petrov's previous crimes.
Petrov had 3 previous convictions. He was released from the labor camp where he served his last sentence on April 3rd, 1988. For a long time, he has not been engaged in any socially useful activities. He's abused alcohol and, while drunk, committed another crime.
It seems less a trial in the Western sense than a public condemnation of the defendant and an affirmation of the infallibility of the state. Virtually no one in the Soviet Union is acquitted in court, only about 6 in 1,000. Some cases are referred back for more investigation and quietly dropped. Others are sentenced to time already served in pretrial detention. The 2 civilian assessors flanking the judge can outvote her in theory, but almost never do. The next step is a reenactment of the crime with a wooden blade.
How were you holding the knife?
Just like this, in my hand.
Like that?
Yes.
And what happened next?
What happened next? I stabbed him, like this.
So you stabbed him.
And the judge asks the victim to describe the incident.
I called him outside and insulted him. I called him a goat. I don't remember why I insulted him. He came outside and we had a drink together. Then we had an argument and I punched him. After that we had a smoke together. I was drunk. I only remember being stabbed in the stomach and the blood coming out.
In a Western courtroom, Gerasimov's admission that he slugged the drunken Petrov first might mitigate the offense, but not here. The judge has heard enough. Tomorrow, she'll pronounce sentence. The case of USSR versus Petrov has adjourned for the night. Down in Moscow, politicians and intellectuals are talking about gumanism, making the criminal laws more humane. They're discussing subjects like trial by jury, presumption of innocence, allowing a suspect the right to a defense lawyer from the moment of arrest. But many Soviet citizens, who now have the right to elect their representatives, want harsher sentences, stiffer punishment. And a poor mug like Petrov is caught in the middle. This lopsided justice is under attack. Criminologist Alexander Yakovlev says the right to real defense counsel must be the first reform.
Before that, the lawyer was able to help his client only after the preliminary investigation ended. And of course, in this situation where the all-powerful state on one side and only me, poor me, without any lawyer near me, against, a lot of possibility for abuse of power exists, indeed.
But with the Soviet government admitting an 84% rise in violent crime this year alone, Yakovlev's reforms are facing opposition from a frightened public and from conservative politicians.
It is just gibberish to blame some softy or legislators or lawyers or scientist workers on the rising of crime. Some of the officials who are opposed to democratization of a society may use it as a pretext for stopping the democratization of a society. Against it, we will fight, of course.
Yet prosecutor Mikhailov sees humanization as a threat to law and order.
I believe that a jury system, for example, is worth implementing for the purpose of determining guilt. But we feel that humanization, that is, humanization towards criminals who commit heinous crimes, is simply wrong. During the early stages of perestroika, there was a retreat from discipline, that is, towards humanization. However, developments in the state of crime in our country have shown that this was, in some ways, erroneous.
According to Article 108, Part 1 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Republic, this court finds the accused guilty of intentionally causing serious life-threatening bodily harm. And this court believes that his re-education requires isolation from society. According to the facts of this case and following the directions of Articles 301 and 303 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Republic, the court sentences Sergei Nikolaevich Petrov to be admitted guilty of committing the crime, which corresponds to Article 108, Part 1, and is hereby sentenced to 6 years of labor to be served in a strict regime colony.
Soviet law permits Petrov to appeal the conviction, but not the severity of the sentence. This is Leningrad Labor Colony 5, a vast complex of barracks and factories home to 2,000 men, the largest labor camp in the European part of the Soviet Union. For the newcomers being processed at the colony gates, men who already have been through months or years of pre-trial detention and a brief courtroom appearance, these are the first few moments of a totally new life. In Soviet terminology, this is called general regime. But to outsiders, it evokes images of dark places, images of the Gulag. Yet as the new men move toward their dormitories, Gorbachev's reforms have penetrated even here. In 1987, he declared an amnesty that sent 40% of prisoners home, and still left nearly 1 million men, women, and children in the colonies. This is one of the more comfortable islands in the vast archipelago of the Soviet Gulag. Leningrad Labor Colony No. 5 is a medium security institution for first offenders, murderers, rapists, hooligans, and thieves. These men spend as little as 1 year here, or as many as 15. And when they leave this place, their workbook carries forever the word prestupnik, criminal. The cornerstone of the Soviet theory of rehabilitation is mandatory labor. Some critics have called it slave labor. This man, a Buryat from Siberia, is serving 6 years for assault.
What am I doing? Polishing these cubes. We do it like this. Shh, shh, shh.
How's the work? Is it boring?
Well, I don't know. I don't think I have much choice.
Sergei Matyukin, the camp commandant, is a Gorbachev appointee, a reformer who's planted flowers around his labor colony, but he believes in correction through work.
I do not disbelieve in reform through labor. I cannot. Because the task before the administrator of such a colony as this is to force the condemned to work. I agree that the most effective method of rehabilitation is through forced labor.
The furniture factory at Colony 5 is comparable to most other Soviet industrial plants. The men receive a small salary, but half of this goes back to the state to pay for their room and board. Extra work hours may be subtracted from a man's sentence. The factory is mandated to turn a profit. Even in the Gulag, there's no such thing as a free lunch. In a country where most citizens must line up for even the most basic foodstuffs, inmates in this colony receive ample servings of soup, porridge, and bread, 3 meals a day, every day. We asked some of them why they were here.
Murder. Murder.
I worked as an expert at a meat processing plant. There were thefts there. But I didn't have anything to do with that.
Me? Well, I've been in for around 2 years now. I stole someone's wallet and got 7 years.
Is the food any good here?
Terrible. It's water with a bit of potatoes. But this labor camp is probably a lot better than the others, or so I hear. The daily routine around here is not too bad. I can bear it. But in some of the other colonies, we hear conditions are still quite horrible. Here, at least, you can live, or rather, survive.
The camp's store. It's available to each man once or twice a month. When we visited, the shelves seemed abundantly well stocked. While the rest of the USSR moves away from the old Marxist fictions, the men of Colony 5 still are surrounded by proclamations of the glory of labor, the correctness of the Communist Party line. The economic and ethnic turmoil tearing the Soviet Union apart seems distant here.
That report was by Alan Abel of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Next, a report on crime in the Soviet Union. It's a subject that was seldom mentioned in the public press in the pre-Gorbachev years. Our report was done for the Journal program of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. The correspondent is Alan Abel.
It's midnight in the new Soviet Union of Mikhail Gorbachev. Police dispatch, Leningrad.
What's the problem?
Что случилось?
Who is causing the disturbance? Your husband? Okay, we're on the way.
The call comes from an apartment block on Vasilyevsky Island.
542, мы подъезжаем в Тухачевского 5.
It's a good, middle-class neighborhood, the flat of Mr. and Mrs. Yuri Pautov. But when the detectives of the People's Criminal Militia arrive, they find Yuri Pautov dead on the kitchen floor. In Leningrad, a life ends, and the work of Soviet justice begins. A specter is haunting the Soviet Union, the specter of violent crime. For 70 years, official Soviet propaganda pretended there was no crime in this country. There was no unemployment. There was no inequality of wealth. There were none of the conditions under which crime could even arise. But today, under Mikhail Gorbachev, the curtain has been lifted, and behind it we see not just crime, but a wave of crime. At the Pautov's apartment, the forensic unit of the militia goes about its grisly routine. This is the 99th killing in 7 months in a city of 5 million people. One incident among many that adds up to an 84% rise in violent crime in just 1 year, according to police statistics. It is not the state terror of Stalin's years, not the knock on the door in the middle of the night that dragged thousands of dissidents away to labor colonies, but ordinary, urban, ugly crime. Sudden death at the dinner hour. For the militia, more protocol, more paperwork. Next morning, Leningrad Police Headquarters, the weekly briefing for crime reporters. A few months ago, there was no such thing as a crime reporter. But this is the age of glasnost, openness. Today's announcement, crime rates for the first 6 months of 1989.
Unfortunately, in this city, that is the city of Leningrad, the crime rate has increased by 23.4%. Parallel to this, the crime rate in the districts outside is increased by 30.6%.
Now, Soviet newspapers and television crackle with sensational crime stories. And the most sizzling show of all, 600 Seconds. This is Leningrad's nightly digest of municipal mayhem. 10 breathless minutes of American-style trash TV.
This is only a small sample of the weapons used by those in the criminal world.
But co-anchor Svetlana Sorokina worries about the effect of a steady diet of crime on an ingenuous audience.
We began by showing some fairly simple crimes and occurrences, and that in itself was new and sensational, because no one had shown it before. Then later we began escalating sensationalism. Now what I've come up against is the fact that if the audience doesn't get a corpse, preferably one being taken down fresh after a hanging or a decomposing body, then many of our viewers feel they've wasted 10 minutes in front of the television because they didn't see anything that titillated them.
And it's not just Leningrad. This is Pushkin Square in Moscow, home office of some of the Soviet Union's major newspapers. Since last winter, when Glasnost was extended from the political realm to include disclosure of violent crime, crowds have clustered around these public display panels, fascinated by each new revelation. Youth gangs on the rampage along the Volga, heroin trafficking in the Asian republics, organized extortion in the Baltic states, protection rackets right here in the Soviet capital. Criminologist Alexander Yakovlev says Soviet citizens have been left without an immune system to protect them from the shock of the truth.
Bad news were non-existent news. And the people, unfortunately, grew complacent, being separated from the realities of life. To confiscate information means to divorce the people from reality. And they may perish not knowing that they are perishing.
In the apartment blocks of cities like Leningrad, crime has come home, followed minutes or hours later by the militia and the Canine Corps. Crime rates are still low by Western standards. 8 serious offenses in the United States for every 1 in the USSR. Here, a simple smash and enter. The thieves demolished a flimsy door. They took a VCR, a fur coat, some jewelry, and a suitcase to carry the loot. And the victim is badly shaken. Like most people here, these owners carried no insurance on the stolen goods. To recover them, they're dependent on the police force, a militia that by its own admission solves only 3 crimes out of every 10. And this time, they go away without a suspect. In a country where the understocked store, the endless queue for goods are symbols of a failed economic system, stealing has become the simplest way to acquire status items.
Social factors such as alcoholism and shortages of consumer goods determine criminality in a society, and Leningrad is no exception. What's happening here is happening all over the country.
What's the answer to the crime wave? What's your answer?
First of all, we need tougher laws. Right now, the laws are too lenient on criminals. Even more important, we have to supply our police with better equipment. You see this phone over here? It's from the 30s. We're 50 years behind in technology. You know our cars, they're falling apart. We have to be given the best equipment available to enforce the laws. With this stuff, we're powerless.
It's a common theme. Dead vehicles, outdated equipment. The police complain publicly now in the era of Glasnost that criminals are better equipped than they are. But Alexander Yakovlev, a leading Soviet criminologist, says they're just covering up their own incompetence.
I think that police are trying to justify their inefficiency. They are apt to magnify the proficiency, the ruthlessness of a criminal and picture themselves as being helpless and small. It is, from my point of view, it is just one way of getting rid of responsibility for not standing against real criminals. You come to the streets of Moscow. On each intersection stays this big guy. I don't know what he's doing here. Perhaps he will bet if he come and look for criminals. So I don't think, perhaps the militia isn't very effective.
At the Dynamo Sports Club in Leningrad, the cream of the people's militia swat each other around. Most are ex-soldiers, farmers' sons who joined the force as an easy way to acquire an urban residence permit. The money is fair, about 180 rubles a month. A factory hand might make 220. Most patrolmen are armed, but regulations forbid firing at a woman or a juvenile. Among this group at a routine marksmanship drill, no one hit the target more than once in 5 shots. People say that by the time a militiaman studies the rules and fires, he's dead 4 times. Officer Irina Paramova.
Incidents where an officer would need a gun are quite rare. I don't think anyone in this class has ever fired a gun in line of duty. So yes, the regulations make it very difficult.
Do you think you could shoot to kill someone?
No, I could not.
The police do have allies. These are the Družiniki, a civilian auxiliary force equipped with red armbands and limited powers of arrest and seizure.
Okay, along with you volunteers, I'm going to patrol some seedy spots. If we notice anything wrong, we'll detain the responsible party or we'll try to sort it out. Okay, let's go.
The Družiniki are a remnant of the old communist theorem that police power springs from the people themselves. But among the population, they're a joke. And Družinik Nick Polansky says that this volunteer brigade is not exactly voluntary.
Once a month, somebody of the workers is delegated to assist the police, yes? So it is my turn, yes, tonight. Tomorrow another worker will go, yes? And etc.
Do you look forward to your turn?
No special interest.
Even the old babushkas say it will take more than armbands to make their streets as safe as in Stalin's day. In Soviet cities, the reality is far different from the old image of a crimeless society. In this era of glasnost, it's clear there is crime, and the Soviet militia face a struggle to contain it.